For the technical difficulties, everyone. We are honored to welcome our first keynote speaker, Sucheta Ghoshal, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Sucheta has been embedded in grassroots social movements in the United States, both as a researcher and as an activist for the last 5 years. Her research focuses on studying how grassroots social movements in the United States relate to information and communication technologies, or ICTs. Broadly, her work strives to critically question ICTs in their totality for the role they continue to play in larger systems of oppression, namely systemic racism, class, caste, and gendered oppressions. Additionally, she is interested in uncovering ways in which we can form public means of consciousness, resistance, and accountability against technology-mediated systems of oppression. Sucheta was formerly a software engineer at the Wikimedia Foundation, where she built several tools for Wikipedia and worked on building a community of Wikipedians in India. She has been a community organizer working in various capacities globally for over a decade. So thanks everyone and welcoming Sucheta.
Thank you. Big words. I've never heard somebody, read out the whole bio that I have for myself. But thank you so much for that. Okay, here we go. Thank you all so much for coming, virtually and in person. I am bummed that I'm not in person, but hoping to get some interaction going, even if virtually. I'll take it. All right, so my name is Sucheta Ghoshal. I am an assistant professor at HCDE, University of Washington. I am a research activist, as you just heard, and I am currently mostly focusing on community-centered design in various aspects, and you'll get to know a little bit more about my work through this talk as well. But before I get into the talk, I just want to give a quick shout out to all the movement communities that I've worked with, particularly my movement family, the Southern Movement Assembly, based out of the US South. And this work would not be possible without them existing and supporting me all the way through. And also I've learned so much about this work. So whenever I'm sharing anything intellectually, politically, and personally even, a lot of it is indebted to the work that they are doing in changing things in the US South. So with that being said, I just want to give a quick overview of the talk that I have for you all. So I'll start a little bit with my positionality and grounding in my personal place in this work. A lot of what I do is very much drawing on being reflexive about who I am and where I come from in relation to the work. And so I want to start with that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the work that I've done in the past that informs a lot of my current work and the current analysis that I have about critical technology practice. The past work on technocultural reproduction is both developmental as well as kind of a theoretical work that I would like to talk a little bit about, so we have that kind of context for what I mean by critical technology practice with my current work at HCDE. So with that being said, I just want to welcome you all in this journey that I want to share about how I got here and how I got to study the technologies of Black US South and what that means to me. So about 25 years ago, I was standing in front of a construction site for a water reservoir or a dam that was built in the service of a thermal power plant. My father was an electrical engineer. He worked at this power plant, and we would often go to this water reservoir to look at the site to bask in the glory of the thermal power plant, as well as this magnificent piece of technology that was kind of changing the game for the power plant as well, in terms of resources and how a very basic necessity for our lives are going to be then produced through this very interesting infrastructure. This was kind of a ritual for us to go there and look at the sunset at the dam. And just when we would start to enjoy this beautiful piece of land and like just the way the sun would set on the water, my father would remind us exactly how many indigenous villages had to drown to make this water body, artificially constructed water body, possible. And this is true. Through this construction, there is a deeper and more tragic story of how a lot of life had to be invisibilized and drowned necessarily for this to be possible at all. And that's interesting because they were promised a lot of, like they were promised quite a bit as a kind of reparation, but none of those were ever promised, and there was very little accountability for how this technology was going to continue to shape their lives, how they would recover from losing their homes and their lives. And so the first technology that came to me as a child was also filled with stories of obviously glory and progress, but also deep exclusion that happened at the cost of the progress that happened at the cost of that kind of exclusion. From that early age, I was told that the story of technology has always been filled with such tensions between progress and systemic exclusion. And our job as technology workers was to question any and all erasures that happened via technology. And obviously, I was 5 years old. I had no idea what that meant. But the point of this story is that technology never came as one thing to me. It was never static. It was never either a story of progress or a story of failure. It was always a story that was complicated and already had two sides. And so, as you can tell, I have always had a rather complicated relationship with technology from the very beginning of my life, as far as I can remember. In 2009, I joined a different kind of technology experience, which is with the Free Software Foundation, which was not a huge jump from how I grew up. From that story, you probably have guessed, my family was very much politically involved, and they, in addition to their affiliations with technologically mediated employments, they were also very much involved politically in changing community and community organizing as a whole. And so from the very young age, I also knew that like all the complicated theories about life and technology, we could solve, not solve, but resolve with the help of community and people, our people. And so when I joined the Free Software movement in 2009, it felt like, it was a different kind of community, but it was still community that was trying to resolve a lot of those similar tensions that came with just technology as we knew it at the time. And they were very much invested in thinking about how can we make technological futures that were not driven by profit and instead were driven by creativity and innovation that were kind of distanced from profit, but had the core quality of community organizing. As I was getting more and more involved in the Wikipedia community and the broader free and open source culture, what was evolving in my own surroundings in India in the South Asian context was a very interesting, yet kind of a giant infrastructure that would later go on to govern a lot of our lives. It's called Aadhaar, a unique identification technology. You can imagine it as the SSN, but it also records biometric and demographic data of residents. So I had, on one hand, my involvement in the Wikimedia community, which is opening up a world of privilege in how I was engaging with technology as a whole. And then on the other hand, my people, again, my community, who I have known from the very beginning of my life, were grappling in their everyday lives with this new infrastructure, new technology that was going to be introducing to them a new world of technological implications that they had not encountered before. And so it was at that kind of, at the end of my Wikipedia involvement, I started to like move my focus to how the Aadhaar implementation was unfolding. And there were a lot of privacy and security risks associated with this technology. And what we tried to do with like our community organizing around this technology when it was first being deployed in society was to kind of have an analysis of why this technology was introduced to the system in the first place. And the political and technological rationality behind this was that this would lead to less corruption in welfare programs. So the primary stakeholders, or the primary people that they were doing this for, are the poor people, the people who would need welfare programs to sustain themselves. In reality, however, according to this current paper, recent paper that just came out, it talks about how these attempts, highly sophisticated, quote unquote, technologically mediated attempts to reduce corruption in welfare programs can also generate non-trivial costs in terms of exclusion and inconvenience to genuine beneficiaries. And really, in this case, the inconvenience that we were seeing was not getting any kind of access to the welfare programs at all due to a lack of access to Aadhaar, and that leading to death. So again, like this was how many years from like just standing in front of that water reservoir. I'm still like, I think, kind of looking at a big, complicated infrastructure of technology that is being introduced to us with the political and technological rationality of how it's going to change the life for those who are marginalized. But then at the same time, what they are providing us with is a lot of tangled webs that we would have to, resolve in the coming years. And in the process, many lives would be lost, and the lives that would be lost are mainly the lives that this is claiming to save. This kind of led me to this place in life where I was thinking a lot about how who we consider to be human in our technological and political rationality are very limited in terms of how we think about who is allowed to be human at all. And so what I was thinking about at this point in my life was how our ideas of progress, technological and human, consider for a very, very few people to be human at all. This was 2016, and I came to the United States, especially the US South, to kind of do something about it, about that revelation that I was having, being like in reality kind of burned out by the organizing and the work that we were doing around how India was changing in terms of its relationship to technology. And I, to be honest, like I came to the United States in the South, in Atlanta in 2016, with the hope of finding some answers in Black organizing. and how they were always, faced with this essential question of what is claiming to save us is actually killing us. And that is especially painfully true for technology and how technology was being deployed in, throughout history. So, which is kind of the moment that marks as my beginning of research with grassroots social movements in the United States South. Particularly, I'm going to be talking more about the work that I've done with the Southern Movement Assembly. The Southern Movement Assembly is a regional movement in the US South that involves more than 110 different organizations, small grassroots organizations across the US South. So they're trying to make the grassroots dream a reality by starting from local movements and then building up to a regional organizing effort. Before we jump more into the findings, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what is it like to create a grassroots organization and do grassroots organizing in the US South. So in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and that was the beginning of a huge political and climate and socioeconomic crisis. In 2017, a group of people from all over the US South, all who had different experiences of living through climate disasters, went to Puerto Rico to help with the local organizing efforts that were happening currently there. And that looked like a lot of things. It looked like, publishing truths and co-developing analysis like this about how the crisis that was unfolding in Puerto Rico is not just a crisis of the climate, it is also the crisis of capitalism. It also meant working on the ground, on the field, for the community to sustain themselves with food and nourishment. It also meant coming together to talk about and analyze and strategize what it would look like to build up what was been destroyed with this crisis of climate and capitalism. And so a lot of people with the experience of systemic injustice coming together with shared analysis is a beautiful and powerful experience. But it's also a really difficult experience to facilitate and manifest. And what that looks like in reality is driven by two core things at the moment. People and relationships, of course. This cannot happen individually. We cannot do this alone, and we don't want to, is a phrase that is often used by a fellow organizer and a participant in a lot of my work. They talk about how the grassroots approach is both at once a practicality and a desire. We cannot do this alone. That is just the truth. But also, we don't want to. We don't want to do this in an individualistic sense. We want to be part of something broader. We want to be part of something large and something connected and something inclusive, something that speaks to many people, even if it doesn't speak to me individually. And naming that as a desire is a very important first step in resolving some of these tensions that we are going to be talking about. Also, the other part of that story being possible at all is also, information communication technologies, which I'll be referring to as ICTs. Information communication technologies like Facebook, like Google Drive, like a lot of poster making sites that you see online. Most of these tools would be very familiar to you if you are in the organizing field or not. I mean, I think these are technologies that are getting more and more mainstream by people who are trying to organize anything at all. They come with the promise of, productivity and efficiency. And obviously, organizations that are overburdened with political analysis look to these technologies to have some form of dependence to develop the kind of real-time analysis and real-time work that they're trying to do. The other side of that truth is that a lot of these technologies do not share the same values and the same kind of politics that grassroots organizing has, but the organizations have to make do with them. So this is something that I started with knowing that there are fundamental difference in how there is a fundamental difference in how these technologies are made and how the organizations are shaped. And this fundamental conflict is not a secret. It's already something that you start knowing as you start building up relationships and as you start involving yourself in organizing it all. But the thing is, despite the dependence with the information communication technologies, the culture of Black US South is also fundamentally at odds with the culture of information communication technologies. And I do want to separate the grassroots organizing as a whole from the culture of a Black grassroots organizing, and how that is also fundamentally at odds with the culture of information communication technologies. And this difference becomes later much more crucial as we start to understand technology as reflections of whiteness and capital. Before we go there, the kind of research that I do, I call it the emancipatory action research, and it's the primary mode of inquiry that I practice in all of my work. And this lets me participate in a community from a position of closeness rather than from a distance, which means that I get to live these experiences. I want to live these experiences. Again, like going back to practicality and desire, I cannot do this work without living it, but I also want to live it. So, simultaneously studying the use of technology and understanding my own relationship to technology is a critical part of this kind of inquiry. So more specifically though, my, all the research that I'm going to be sharing, they come from the data collection methods are anything ranging from field notes to semi-structured interviews to workshops. The analysis that I do, it draws a lot from like self-reflexivity, reflexivity as a whole. And then I do a lot of theoretical analysis, theoretical engagement with critical and political theories. One of them, which I would be discussing today, and then qualitative analysis. I also design tools with these communities as we go along. And the tool making process, the making itself becomes another line of inquiry that uncovers a lot of new insights as well. All of this is happening with active participation, of course. So going back to the site of the Southern Movement Assembly, in 2017, I also joined an annual meeting with them and kind of realized that they were using a variety of tools, including the most popular technologies that I mentioned before. However, a meeting that we were discussing on the field, I was also involved in grassroots organizing already in the South with a different organization at the time of this meeting. And so I went there as a participant, but I also went there as kind of like a fellow organizer who was sitting down with a lot of Southern Movement Assembly folks who were going through this already. And we were talking about how there was a meeting in rural Mississippi that they were having, where the lowest representation in that meeting was from the town where the meeting was held. And this was kind of a huge failure in terms of grassroots organizing, because if you cannot involve the local people where you're taking your movement to, then there has been a glitch in the system, right? Like that's not the systematic kind of building up that they're trying to do. And after some analysis, we were thinking about like, how were the people recruited? How did the people get to know that this meeting was happening at all? And turned out that most of their, most of their organizing efforts, most of their reaching out happen via technological platforms like Facebook or Zoom meetings or websites, Twitter, etc. And then we also realized that the registration system itself was through a Google form that was sent out via email. And there was like very little to almost no on the ground registration opportunity at all. So either people came, there was no way to actually record how many people came, or there were no way for the local people to know that this event was happening at all. And it was like kind of an interestingly eye-opening moment of thinking about, really, do we want this to be the culture of organizing, where most of our organizing is happening through centralized systems like Google or Facebook, whose culture we are actively resisting on the ground with our movements. And meanwhile, we are forgetting to include the people that would be included, and not only included, but centered around, if we were to think about the theories and the politics of grassroots organizing. So it is at that kind of intersection and junction that I kind of started collaborating with the Southern Movement Assembly. I was bringing over a lot of my experience with the Global South organizing, and Southern Movement Assembly has been invested in kind of, politically expanding what we mean by the South beyond just the US South. And so really grappling with the questions of how the Black US South fits in the overall socioeconomic and political and geographical even context of the US. So building relationships, building that kind of transnational solidarity was as at the core of this organizing relationship that I jumped into with the Southern Movement Assembly, and I've been in that ever since. What that meant was using this kind of solidarity as a tool to uncover core truths about the grassroots culture that they were practicing in the Southern Movement Assembly. And a lot of people did discuss how being in the Southern Movement Assembly is to live something that has not been allowed by segregation, by white supremacy in the rural Black US South for the longest time. And being there is kind of a resistance against that kind of forced alienation in on itself. It also talked about how this culture meant for them a kind of a testing ground, not exactly a testing ground, but almost like how to live the life that you would like to imagine living. And in many cases, the institutions of power would not, the popular institutions of power, the nation state would not let them live the way that they would like to live. And in many ways, the movements are become a different community where you're kind of making your desires and dreams of living in freedom come true. And so it has to have a different culture than the institutions and power. On the other hand, though, there was another discussion about like how a lot of people in the community were hostile towards technology. And again, like this narrative, you would hear different narratives if you talk to different kinds of people. And that's where the analysis gets to eventually. But basically, if there were people who were on the management side of things, like the people who were managing the websites, the people who were, writing on the Google Drive documents and managing the registration, they would say that the rest of the community was hostile to technology and not getting on board with this progress that they were making internally with the use of popular technologies that drive productivity and, massively. On the other hand, when I was going into workshops and talking to the people who we were doing workshops with in rural Mississippi and South Carolina, Georgia, they talked about how online campaigns make them feel isolated, especially for people who do not have stable internet connections and may not even have smartphones. And so to make the online organizing part as the default of organizing feels like a statement to them about how they do not belong in the community. They also started to worry that the community as a whole was overvaluing technology and undervaluing the importance of relationship building, which is at the core of their own politic. And that was a concerning bit that leads on to, like reflect them onto like very important things about how they feel about technology as a whole. It's not a specific, it's not sometimes a specific thing towards Zoom, but just the idea of making organizing against white supremacy and capitalism and all these big structures of oppression around technology and with technology makes them think about how conflicted they feel about this whole new culture, because for them it was hard to think about technology at all without thinking about slavery, without thinking about stolen innovations from Black people of the South, and how technology has always meant the power that they did not have. And in many cases, this online technology-driven organizing felt like reliving that experience without adequate analysis and support. So what we were seeing was that in SMA's expectation, more information communication technology meant that they would have more relevance among young people who would be coming to these, organizing efforts, more inclusion, because it is reaching to the people in their expectation, the people that were previously not being able to reach to, and more efficient organizing. The efficiency part is key, because these organizations are often, like I said, overburdened with analysis and work. And so efficiency, when you're promising efficiency through a technology, it means something really critical and important, and more funding, because all of these ultimately lead to a kind of a portfolio that is accepted, not only acceptable, but rewarded by foundations that support these organizations that are trying to live. Even though SMA is kind of trying to also reimagine the kind of financial and socioeconomic foundations that we require to run movements, it still has to depend on foundation money and funding. And so having like a presence online increases the legitimacy that eventually lead to more funding and more credibility in communities. In SMA reality, however, majority were intimidated by technology, threatened by technological means of organizing, and technical competence was often associated with whiteness and wealth. A lot of people who I talked to when I talked about how they thought that the rest of the community was hostile to technology really meant the people who were managing the websites, creating the databases, and doing the work of technological portion of organizing were often either coming from wealthier backgrounds, or they were white and they were trying to fit in a majority Black organizing drive, and they were providing their expertise of efficiency into the service of this organizing, with the intent that this was going to help in building up a more cohesive organizing tactic. And then eventually, because they have the technological means to organize, the technically competent people end up having more power, because technology, again, in the perception of people, means power, and in the perception of society also means power. So I was trying to make sense of this, and one of the things that we already know, that technology having cultural consequences and conflicts is not a new thing. This has happened before. We have been here before. And the theory that I took to was technocultural theory from Arnold Pacey. And Arnold Pacey talks about how we often think of technology for its technical aspect. It's a restricted understanding of technology that only means knowledge, skill, techniques, tools, machines, chemicals, resources, products, and wastes. But if we expand that vision of technology or understanding of technology and include the cultural and the organizational aspect of it, we start to gain a bit more perspective about what technology is to people and what technology is to society. And clearly, it is not just a tool to people. It means a lot more. So a lot of the times it talks about how, with this theoretical framework, especially, you start seeing how the artifacts that SMA were using, the Google Drives, the Zooms of the organizing, the Dropbox, the Canva platform, the Microsoft Word, and the email platform that they were using, all of these are coming from somewhere. They're not tools that just arrived out of nowhere. They have been produced with certain cultures in mind. And often these cultures, this is well-documented fact, that they're coming with certain kinds of beliefs and practices of these workplace cultures that they're being produced from. So what happens when we bring that to the table of analysis? Again, what we have seen is that these tools have shown particular kinds of systemic exclusion around, class, caste, race-based exclusions that directly lead to the profit and the development of these organizations and corporations sometimes. So really, the kinds of exclusion that these big tech essentially benefits from is what we see in SMA as well. Technical competence being associated with whiteness, masculinity, people having more power, people who knew technology having more power. These are things that are constantly happening in Silicon Valley and the sites of production of the technologies that SMA were using. So how does that happen that a community that has nothing in common with the sites of production of technologies that we are talking about have the same kinds of symptoms that we see from the original sites? So the technocultural reproduction theory, which is what I wrote a lot about, is basically talking about how having ICT artifacts as the only common agent between these two different cultures, the ICT artifacts create this condition in which the cultural values from the sites of production then reproduce into the cultural values of the site of use. So in this case, the cultural values of big tech often reproduce into the grassroots culture that we see in the Black US South. We started reimagining this. We started reimagining how a grassroots technology practice would look like if we were to ground it in the values of Black radical tradition, in the values that SMA believed in the most. And that led us to do a lot of participatory workshops, create movement artifacts that started from the engagement at different workshops that we did in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. A lot of it, the crux of it, was to reframe the refusal or the hostility towards using popular technologies as legitimate critiques of white capitalist and often carceral and anti-Black technoculture. And what that reframing does is that it shifts the power from technology to the people. For one of the many magics that happened through this is that people started naming technologies that were not just digital technologies anymore. Technologies of food, technologies of being able to build community while being forced or having community dismantled around you constantly, that got named as technology organically in one of these gatherings that we did. And that was kind of a shift that was happening throughout, where technology started meaning more than just these artifacts, the tools that we were seeing in use. in one of the later on meetings, we started collaborating with Black-owned radio stations, local print media. We used alternative communication technologies like Wi-Fi repeaters, just to make sure that we didn't get limited by the technological affordances, or basically, like, we got to have the meeting in a place where there was little to no internet connection with the use of these technologies, and the turnout was great. Social media didn't like completely disappear from this matrix, right? Like it was there, but it was being used consciously with the knowledge that just by the use of it, a lot of people would get excluded. So this is how I've been working with my work with the SMA was to build grassroots technology practice as resistance against whiteness and as technology. And what I mean by that, whiteness and as technology, is building on scholar Wendy Chun's framing of race and as technology. It opens up two possibilities. One is the way in which whiteness, and often capital associated with whiteness, and just capital as its own entity, and technology, they create each other's logic and development, and also the patterns and similarities that make whiteness often pose as technology at times. And so seeing those two be on the surface, on the table, on your analysis, opens up new opportunities to build against it. So that's what I am doing currently with critical technology practice. Thinking about how to build public infrastructures of resistance and accountability with that analysis in mind towards information communication technologies. So really extending the grassroots technology practice that we did with critical theories of whiteness, gender, sexuality, capital, towards this kind of agenda that I have. This is not a completely novel thing. Phil Agre, scholar, HCI scholar in social informatics researcher, Phil Agre, talked about what a critical technical practice may look like in the reform of AI. And I built on that with more heavy leanings towards critical theories. And he talks a lot about how our work would need us to be, need our one foot to be planted in the craft work of design, and then the other foot will have to be planted in the reflexive work of critique. And this reflexive work of critique, I pay special and intentional attention to the work coming from, from beyond the West, thinking more in terms of what that Southern solidarity really looks like, what it means to extend the understanding of Blackness from situated in the US South to what it means to the broader South in general. So the three main questions really that I've been thinking about are what would it take for us to build technologies of resistance in an ongoing global crisis of fascism, capitalism, anti-Blackness? How can we best locate technology in these intersecting forces of harm, and what comes after this analysis? I formed my lab called Inkilab. Inkilab in Urdu means long live, or it means revolution. The Inkilab word is the revolution. And then Inkilab Zindabad was a slogan that was used by the Indian freedom fighters in the anti-colonial movement. That meant long live the revolution. So it's an homage to that. At Inkilab, currently I'm doing two kinds of work, potentially three. One is kind of being developed. Still, one is understanding power and governmentality, and like really kind of doing more of an analysis on that technological and political rationality behind some of these mega technologies that we see that govern our lives. And then also thinking more about like, what can we do with that kind of analysis of power? It is to, inform the kind of relational organizing that we do locally and transnationally. Towards understanding power and governmentality, I have been working on a mega project with the Seattle Department of Transportation understanding how a data-driven system is now being deployed and designed to change the work practices of Department of Transportation folks, and what that changes for the work culture, how that changes things for the public, what it means to actually depend on these mega structures at all. In terms of the relational organizing, I organized the Other Wise School in the summer of 2021, which I think is a critical next step that I have taken from the the kind of work that I did in the Black US South, and with bringing on the Global South agenda of decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist work. So the three main things that we have been kind of thinking about with the Other Wise School has been how to decenter the West and center the South. Intersectionality and Black feminist thought has been at the front and center of this work, and thinking about abolition as a methodology in this work. And lastly, two notes that I would like to leave this on is I think like a big part of that reframing of, not think about hostility and refusal as a weakness or as something that needs to be fixed with, fixing the digital divide or whatnot. I hate that word. To thinking more about like, what would change if we thought that actually the people who have been oppressed for this long have a highly sophisticated and accurate critique of how technology has been shaping the lives of our own. And on the other hand, how do we actually look at these lives as not as a deficit, not as a deficit mindset, but how they're building resources, living life joyfully and happily, even despite all of the things that all of these forces of oppression are causing to them. I draw a lot from Catherine McCrittrick and the understanding of how much we can gain from understanding these sites as not as sites of oppression. I mean, not to invalidate the oppression, but also to celebrate the life on its own. In that note, just to say that despite all of this, we are here, we exist in the excess of the language that is often used to justify our terror. And I hope to kind of take the spirit to keep on building the kind of critical technology practice. And I invite you all to do the same.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor up to questions. I'm not sure if, we can.
Hi.
Sorry, we're just figuring out the Zoom situation. Does anybody in the room have a question? And I can start if not. There might be some in the chat.
If anyone in the chat wants to raise their hand or.
Okay, while we're figuring that out,
we
I'll
go.
start. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about a little bit more about the Other Wise School. I'm really interested to hear your opinion of where education fits into this as a practice as well, as kind of getting people together and like educating each other. And I wanted to hear about the experience of building that school and how you feel about the role of education in this process.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what movement organizing is political education, and accessibly doing political education in a way that enables people to question the logics that we talk about a lot. And so, I mean, the otherwise school was, we had a lot of discussion around like naming it the school because it sounds so formal, even though it really isn't and really wasn't, at least. But I think like an important part that we have been trying to instill with the otherwise school was how do we kind of approach this building off movement from scratch sometimes against the face of really big structural things that are facing us in a really systematic way. And I think the role of education, not only the awareness part, but also like how to strategically do this work comes, you know, that part I think is very much important. And doing that kind of education within our communities with care, with the kind of gentle work that we need to do is super important. And I mean, I don't know what else to say. I think like public education, like the kind of political education that I've been doing, even with the organizing efforts that happened in rural US South as well, has been key to like where we got. So I don't think I can imagine a movement without education efforts.
Thank you.
We have one coming up from Hardy.
Okay, we're unmuting. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, how are you? Hey, I just wanted to say thank you. It was an excellent talk and you brought so much to light. I don't really know where to begin, but I guess I'll begin with the thought you brought forward as to the attitudes towards technology within the rural South, you know, which is eye-opening. You know, when you live in other parts of the United States, you may not really connect with the idea that, you know, technology can be seen as part of the other. You know, it's this thing that, you know, is linked to whiteness, you know, so to speak. You know, so how it seems as though the open source movement and some of the ideals within the open source movement, as you know, talked about, can align very well with the goals and ideas of these grassroots organizations. But at the same time, there's something very much entrenched there. There's an idea that any form of technology may be part of the other. So how do you see bridging that gap? How do you see embracing the open source movement within these organizations so that they can build their tools in order to further the ideals of their, you know, their activism?
That's such an important question, and something that I think about a lot. So the free and open source software movement is also supremely white, and I just want to note that because I think that's important. I think a lot of the history of technology that we have to kind of reconcile with, the technologies that have been liberatory, the technologies that have been opposite of that, are, I mean, there is a lot of whiteness entangled with the history of technology itself, and that is to be reconciled with. I think, though, the idea of open source and free software, free knowledge, even though it took off with a very Western, white Western framing because they had the money to do that, is not essentially just a very white Western thing. Like, I think free and open knowledge goes back to a lot of, at least like, you know, South Asian cultures that evolved through the history of time. Thinking about that is also important, how public, like kind of that kind of open knowledge and open source, and more than just like open sourcing your code, and thinking more about like in terms of how a lot of the artifacts that SME created, they didn't call it the open source whatever, they didn't think about the licensing, the technology around it, but they had a, you know, the culture was there, the culture of freely sharing for the purpose and the overall goal of liberation has been around, again, as a practicality and as a desire. So I think it's both on the very pragmatic side. I believe that it's the task of the open source communities to recognize the unbearable whiteness of their culture and start resolving that. But on the other hand, I think, like, yes, there are inherent parallels in the values, and I've been kind of trying to do work with communities where we talk about the free software culture, kind of separating the whiteness of it with the separating from the whiteness of it and thinking more about like the inherent values that can benefit us. So it has to be a conversation, but I think it's not all on the communities that are feeling rejected by technology and the culture of technology as a whole to start thinking about, like, well, what are the more value aligned technologies, and let us get there and see whether we can fit in. I think it's more on the people of the free and open source software movement to get there. And I mean, I'm kind of trying to do the work of both sides, I think, but I would love to, work more on bringing the open source and free software community to also think more in terms of how they align with Black radical tradition, for example.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Opening up to any other questions?
We have one from Christian.
Okay, Christian.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. I was super interested in all of what you had to say, as I do quite a bit of activism work in the local community here in Providence, and we're going through a phase through the organization where we're starting to see some of these technological challenges and conflicts, right? In the area of immigration, for example, we can talk about how we have to use Google Docs and do all these things when, Google themselves are, have the Palantir engine that is kind of running face recognition, the Border Patrol and these massive databases of immigrants and things like that. And so we're also, very mindful of these tools. I think you generically call them in a group of TCIs, if I understood correctly. And my question would be, is as we support in these organizations, we're trying to, as you said, be flexible and efficient with our internal workflows to, concentrate on the work that we're doing for our communities. Is there a place maybe that you would suggest to start when looking for these types of tools to introduce and maybe move away from some of the other platforms that are more easily accessible and known? Any tips that you might recommend around those areas?
Yeah, well, so this is this hits home so hard. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in similar efforts as well, but there's like so much around, there's a very specific kind of helplessness that comes with organizing around immigration, especially because most of the people who are organizing around immigration are also terrified to organize, because that means like real threats and like all of organizing. It's not unique, but there is a unique kind of helplessness that goes back to the idea of nation state itself. And yes, so technologies that, I mean, I think a lot of people that I have seen use Signal as a kind of a more secure way of organizing around it. The problem with that is often it's not the most user-friendly way of dealing with it, and people who are already, again, like, user-friendliness is kind of like a one of those values that make it easier on people who are already having a hard time with everything else. So there is such a thing. I will say though, Equality Labs, I just want to give them a quick shout out, because they've been doing a lot of, they have kind of an infographic, but also like a whole course on how to securely do organizing, either avoiding big tech or using big tech, but appropriating it with proper security and privacy measures. So you're doing it with the awareness and also the proper protection for yourselves. So shout out to Equality Labs, the organization that has been working immensely to do this work.
Thank you so much. Are there any last minute questions that we missed? Okay.
I also have my email and my Twitter handle. So if you all want to reach me with questions later on, email is a fairly good way to do that.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all for the great questions as well as inviting me. Well, thank you.
I'd like to encourage everyone to stick around for Alex's talk. We're going to be starting that in a new link, a new Zoom. So the link for that Zoom is in the chat. It's also on our website. And then and we'll welcome her over there. So please join us for Alex's talk starting now. We're gonna switch over to the next Zoom. But thank you so much again. Take care.